Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Music Lab podcast. My name is Dogg, and I'm so excited to be back with all of you for another episode of the podcast. Today, I am so excited to talk to Tobi Parks, who has this amazing technology that is coming to you, and it's here now, and we're going to talk all about it. Welcome, Tobi.
Hey, Doug, thanks for having me.
Of course. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, our social media pages. That helps us and helps the bands and artists and music professionals like Tobi. Also, check out our sponsor, RAR Outfitters. That's RAWR, outfitters.com. Don't just wear, RAR. So, Miss Tobi, you are from Brooklyn, New York. You've been there, or you were there since 2015. And then, of all places in the world, we moved to Des Moines, Iowa. Share with everyone first, before we get into like your born and raised and all that story. I just want to know that like shift from New York to Des Moines.
Yeah, well, love New York. I was in Brooklyn. I'm actually originally from St. Louis, Missouri. Moved to Brooklyn, was in New York for about 12 years. And basically around 2012, my wife and I, we had a couple of kids, and anybody who has kids living in New York City understands like how painfully difficult it can be. We didn't end up moving until 2015, but around 2012, we decided we wanted to leave the city and started looking at different places. And our prerequisites were someplace where we had family, and at that time, someplace where we could still be gay married because gay marriage wasn't legal everywhere. And by default, it happened to be Iowa. Iowa was one of the early states to adopt gay marriage, and my sister-in-law was a professor at Drake University here. I was just close by my music venue, actually. And I was like, there's no way I'm moving to Des Moines, Iowa. There's nothing there other than corn and soybeans. And in that intervening 3 years between 2012 and 2015, when we actually moved, I started coming to visit the city and met different people in the creative community and actually ended up falling in love with the place. And it's fascinating because around the time that I was doing the move and we were kind of contemplating leaving New York, there was an article that had come out with Patti Smith, and she was like having this conversation about how, like, the next great musical revolution isn't going to be in the New York or the LAs of the world. It's going to be in these secondary and tertiary cities. And that's exactly what I felt when I came to Des Moines and like met folks. Like I happened to come the first time because I'd started reaching out to different folks, and there's an organization here called the Des Moines Music Coalition, and they had an annual conference that they called Music University, where they'd get local musicians together, and they'd fly in people, different industry professionals to talk about the business, and they'd flown me out to talk, and had just seen like it was so cool to see a community come together and just want to like make their community better, and like the amount of like camaraderie and partnership that not only was it just the musicians in the community, but actually the folks around the community, like the different industry professionals, businesses, philanthropists, all these people kind of came together to help build art and culture in this community, and it was awesome. And it's like I'm such a community oriented person, and so totally fell in love. And then we moved in 2015, and since then it's been amazing. It's been amazing. It's been amazing for my kids. It's one of those things exactly in terms of like the musical revolution that Patti Smith was talking about. I was able to open a music venue here. Would never be able to open a music venue in Brooklyn. I mean, I wouldn't say never, but the likelihood is very small. I own multiple pieces of real estate, able to really like make difference in people's lives, and it's been a life changing move. So I highly recommend. I love New York. I miss it every day, but I do highly recommend giving a shot to some of these secondary and tertiary cities because there's a lot of really cool stuff happening.
So, for someone who wears so many hats currently, and it sounds like, through your professional career, you've worn a lot of hats. What was the first hat that really, inspired you?
Being a musician, that's actually where it all started. I have been playing, I mean, I say professionally, well, whatever one determines what's professional or not, but, I've been making money playing music since I was about 14. I grew up in, as I was mentioning, I say St. Louis. I actually grew up in rural Southeast Missouri and grew up playing in like my cousin's bar band, right? So it's like, he's 25 and I'm 14 and like a kid playing guitar in like these rural country, country bars, playing covers until, 2 a.m. And started because I wanted to be a musician, but always had a little bit of that fear of like, well, I'm not formally trained. And so I've always kind of stayed curious in these kind of music adjacent ways. So it's like, when it's time to go to college, I was like, I want to be a music major, but like, I can't read music very well. And so, I'm not going to be able to compete. So I was an audio production major at my university. And so did that. And then, ended up moving to New York and wanting to do music full time and was like, oh, but I also like to eat food, so I need to find some job. And so ended up working at a major label that sort of, the work that I did there really changed the trajectory of my career going forward into a lot of what I'm doing now. But it all started from just a deep love and appreciation of music and wanting to be a musician.
So was there a professor or a particular like maybe fellow student that like had an impact on you during your university? And then, what made that connection that got you this, major label like job?
N- um, Not really. I mean, again, like I said, I've been a constantly sort of curious person, and like to stay busy. And like, it's more of just like really, when I have an interest in something, I try to learn everything about it. And so when I went to college, and as I said, I was an audio production major at a university in St. Louis called Webster University. And this was in 1994. So I was like one of, you know, three women, I think, in the audio production program there. And, we're working on reel to reels and that kind of stuff. The early days of Pro Tools, and realized I was not a great engineer. And one of the professors there was like, well, maybe you'd have interest in radio. And so there was a campus radio station that was there as like this citywide jazz station. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about jazz, but, fine, I'll go and do this. And, really, I mean, that actually was interesting 'cause it sort of expanded my world of music because, I was like a rock kid basically, and it's like, well, if it isn't, some sort of underground indie whatever, like I'm not going to listen to it. And when you're 18 or 19, you're not necessarily expanding your realms in the world of jazz and understanding that. And so really got super into jazz, like, ended up becoming the program director for this radio station at the same time. Was a college marketing rep for Interscope Records, and then ended up getting a job that actually paid me money at a record store. So it's like I was learning kind of the retail side of the industry, learning, radio stuff, learning, the record side of the business, and sort of being involved in all of those elements. And then graduated from college, ended up working for ended up becoming like a Clear Channel station affiliate, like an urban cluster in St. Louis. Did that for a while as a DJ on a gospel radio station for a minute. Well, it's like I'd do the overnights at the gospel station and would wake up and do like all of the promo stuff for the hip hop station, and then, go do our remote broadcast for like the adult contemporary urban station.
Did you have a
Decided
catchphrase?
What's that?
Did you have
It
a
was, well,
catchphrase?
the myself personally, no, no, but I wasn't that cool. I was just kind of the person who, it's like I tell you, there's a lot of interesting people that listen to gospel music at 2 a.m. I will tell you that much. But did that for a while, and then decided that I wanted to go back and get my graduate degree. I got a graduate degree in media literacy, but went back to Webster to get that degree, but then also took over the radio program and became an adjunct professor. So I was like teaching, running that radio station, getting a master's. And then in the meantime, like playing in a band. So it was also like kind of touring. Like, one of the reasons why I took that job as working at the university was also one of the reasons I get my graduate degree, and I'm still paying for it now. But it helped fund my band tours on the summers, right? So I'd have the summers off. took out student loans, used those student loans to take my band on tour, and did all of that stuff, and then finished up my graduate degree and decided I wanted to move to New York and wanted to be a full-time musician. But much harder said than done. Went there and I worked for a PBS program for a while. It's called End the Life. It was actually one of the first all gay television shows in the country. It was nationally syndicated on PBS across like 350 stations. It's no longer now, but did community relations work with them. Quit that job because again, I was like, I want to be a full-time musician. And then again, like I said, I like to eat food and was like, okay, every job I've ever taken, I've sort of jumped in and wanted to like just know everything about it. Like I don't really just sort of set back and just like do just sort of go through the motions. And I was like, I just want a job that I can go through the motions at. And I had a friend who was working at a major label. And at the time, it was sort of at the dawning of the digital era. So, the labels had been selling stuff on, it's like back in the day of like, iTunes downloads and stuff. And they had been figured out a way to like merchandise the digital downloads, but hadn't quite figured out internally the appropriate systems to necessarily do all of the royalty accounting, right? So they'd sold all of this stuff and they had all this backlog of digital sales that they were, trying to match and pay songwriters and all of that kind of stuff. And so the label had hired this group of temps to come in and basically they gave me a spreadsheet and was like, here are all of these ISRCs for all these tracks that we've sold. Go find the songwriters, set them up in our system so we can pay these songwriters. And I was like, okay, this is great. I can go put on some headphones and just do data entry. And then ended up like really falling in love with that area of the business and just kind of really understanding. One, it was the timing was unique because again, like I said, it was at this sort of convergence of the industry sort of facing the digital revolution a little bit.
Sure.
So it was not only like getting this sort of quick education in what, copyright and publishing was in the United States, which is unique to any other territory in the world, but then also like really understanding, I was in this department, which was heavily, it had turned sort of heavily legal in this way. Where we're like trying to figure out like they're creating new sort of digital products and the industry hadn't even decided what they are. Like a ringtone, is that really a phonograph record or is it non-permanent stream? Like what are these things, and so got to be a part of a lot of that process and decision making for the company in terms of how we handled those things. And it was a real learning exercise and ended up staying with the company for about 20 years. On and off, I was, there for about 12, actually, no. Yeah, it's probably like 12 or 13 years, left for a couple of years. Then the pandemic came back, and then I came back as an attorney doing business affairs work, and then actually left in December. So, it was a lot. That was a lot.
Yeah, there's a
So,
lot there. So my first, okay, so I guess my reaction to that, was there like a glaring, or maybe not even glaring, but was there in this process of as you're, as the labels are trying to figure out this digital evolution, as you look back now, was there like a glaring mistake that they made that maybe like could have changed things like going forward? Like,
I, I don't think so. I mean, I think the thing that people don't understand, and it's strange because like I am a person who very like indie at my like I'm like a punk rock kid, and very community oriented, and like this indie person, like sort of anti-corporate, and then had this whole career working at this big corporate label that everybody is always seen as, it's like the majors are like these evil, the evil empire. And really, those businesses are filled with a lot of people trying to do the right thing, and really, when you sort of are inside the machine and sort of see the inner machinations of it, I don't think that it's anything that anybody did glaringly wrong. I think that it's just that you're looking at it's very practical, actually. There are systems that are built to handle, and again, the part that I'm talking about is again very much related to copyright and royalties and systematic things in the company that for, decades and decades and decades have been handled a certain way, right? It's like, you're selling, vinyl, or you're selling, cassette tapes or whatever, and you build these systems to handle the payment structures and the licensing and all of that stuff the way that it should be. And then any change that's to that, you have to upend all of that and then migrate sort of all of the stuff that you've done into these new systems, right? And you're talking about literally decades of records and decades of things that have to be sort of integrated into a new system. And that doesn't happen overnight, and to make sure that, that the train doesn't come to a halt,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think that, if anything, it's just more of, I don't think that it's that the industry did anything necessarily wrong or people did anything wrong. I think it's just by the nature of data. I mean, it's not just the music industry. It's like any industry. It's like, the banking industry. It took a while to change from the system to the next system, and whatever the businesses might be. Just modernization is hard. And then when you're talking about things where, it's such a heavy data load, it's like, I don't know if people fully understand, but it's like, and I'm coming from kind of a royalty accounting perspective, but you even look at a record, and I'll just say from like the copyright side, the way that copyright works in the United States is it's a share by share licensing mechanism, right? So it's not like, in other territories, it's sort of like, you pay a society, and then the society, you pay one entity, that entity goes and they pay all of the individual people that, are royalty participants. But on the label side, it's, it was our job to not only are you paying the artist and the producers and the mixers and all of those folks, but every song, and as the modern era has moved forward, it's gotten much more complicated. So it's like, it was different when it was just you're putting out a Bruce Springsteen record, and it's Bruce and maybe one other writer or something, compared to like what the modern Beyonce record is, where you're talking about 17 writers and 15 samples and whatever on one song, right? And that's just hard to track. It's a lot of data moving from one entity to the next, and everybody's kind of interdependent. But then at the same time, it's like, you have artists that are just trying to get their work out the door, right? And then you have sort of these legal requirements that, you have to meet, or else you're going to get sued, right? And then you have, sort of the fiduciary pieces of it, where you have to make sure that you're paying people appropriately, and maybe you don't have all of the information. It's like, somebody delivers a record, they want the record to go out the door, and maybe they didn't get all of the contact information to every songwriter who bopped in the studio and threw down a verse and left, and has no idea that they're even due royalties on something, right? So I think it's just a matter of the nature of the business. And going back to your question, I don't think anybody did anything wrong. I think it's just a behemoth. This business is a behemoth. And, when you're talking about something that's so ingrained, things don't change quickly. And you can't, just by virtue of how much data we're trying to navigate.
Right. So, as a touring musician, then obviously you've seen a lot of the country, most of the country.
Mhm.
If you weren't in Des Moines, would there be another city that you would like live in, or that you have kind of like a in your heart for?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if I didn't have kids, I probably wouldn't have left Brooklyn. I love New York City. I mean, I've never done heroin in my entire life, but I always say, like, being a New Yorker is kind of like being a heroin addict. It's like when you're there, it feels so hard and it's like a struggle. And then, everybody who lives in New York knows it's like, okay, well, you finally get your weekend away, or like your week away, and it's like you sleep for the first 3 days because you've just been kind of going, going, going. And then after that, you're like jonesing to get back. You're like, I can't take it anymore. I got to get back into the thing. And so I love New York. You know, I have a deep love for St. Louis, which is where I'm from. Minneapolis too, which is sort of our Des Moines neighbor to the north. Love Minneapolis, Chicago, yeah, like any of those places. But I want to be someplace that's warm, right? So it's like I'm not a huge fan of the warmer cities, even though I want to be someplace that it's like 70 degrees all the time. So.
So I would assume then your balance of life and work must be a challenge. Is that something that's more of a roller coaster, or do you kind of have it figured out now?
Ooh, that is a great question. My wife might have a different response to this question than me. Um, it's forever learning. I mean, and it's the thing that I tell my kids too. I'm incredibly fortunate in the fact that, my work doesn't feel like work because I love what I do, right? And it's part of just who I am as a person. Like it's like people always say like, "Oh, Toby, you do so many things, or you're sort of this jack of all trades." It all is under the umbrella of music, right? And it's just like I get to come to work every day and get to work in this amazing business. And whether it's me doing legal work for a band or, starting a tech company that's dealing with some of these things or like running my venue or, having worked at a label or whatever it is. Um, it's all just kind of, in the world of music, what I love. And so like in terms of balance, um, it's hard to say because it's like even in my spare time, it's like it's so funny to say. Just like last weekend, I went on a weekend retreat with some friends of mine, and it was like, all we did was business strategize, and created a whole new business idea that we want to do, and that's fun to me. So it's like, even in my spare time, that's like I kind of, I'm an entrepreneur at heart, I guess, and so, my hobbies are creating businesses or things to do. So. But I have, I think, gotten more to a place as I've gotten older and kind of just tired. Realizing, slowing down is probably not a bad thing. So trying, it's forever a quest to find the right work-life balance. But I love my life, and I'm incredibly fortunate to do what I do, and it never feels like work. So.
So do you feel like you're going to be that person that works until they're dead, or do you feel like you could retire in 10 years and be totally happy?
It's so funny. I was actually having this conversation with a good friend of mine just last week. I was like, I want to retire at 56, and why 56? I don't really know. But she was like, you're going to retire? Like, she's like, I can't ever see myself ever doing it. It's like, well, no, it's like, I don't want to be, and it's not that I'm working that hard, um, but I want to just be able to kind of, you know, not be stressed about the work, right? Like I want to be able to just sort of like I want to be involved in things and I want to continue to do things and continue to create things, but I want to remove some more of the stress of what it is of being an entrepreneur, I guess. So to that extent, I guess not necessarily that I want to retire at 56, but what I want is all of the business ventures that I've created and that I'm doing to be on sort of like a nice flow, like they're stable, and I can just kind of like oversee the things and they kind of run themselves.
I mean, life is full of ideas. It's just what
Yeah,
you
yeah.
do with those ideas, right? I mean,
Right, right, exactly. Like, and I can never imagine myself like I'm just not that kind of person. Like, I see a problem or I see a thing and kind of want to fix it, or I'm also like kind of a persistent sort of helper. Or if anybody has, somebody has a good idea that intrigues me, like I'm the first person to raise my hand to be like, I'm in. So I don't think that that'll ever really stop, but I think my wife would want me to slow down a little bit more. But
so when you go to a concert, are you able to actually enjoy the concert, or are you constantly looking at like things? Are you hearing things? Are you looking for like stuff? Or are you like a chef that can't go out to eat like that kind of that thing?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say like anybody who's a promoter who owns a venue, like, we make a habit of kind of going into other rooms and being like, oh, that's really interesting that they did this or they did that. And so you're always kind of like looking or comparing or like, sort of taking it in. So yeah, it can be, I won't say that it's necessarily hard to enjoy the show, but it's kind of like all part of it. But at the end of the day, I think the part that I love so much about being a promoter and like owning a venue, and going to a concert is just like the collective sense of joy that people have and knowing, my favorite thing is like when I see people leave my venue at night, I know that I was part of the best part of their day, and that's amazing, to know that you get to be a part of that. And I think that's part of why we all do it. Like there's a lot of business behind it and there's a lot of, it can be headaches and stomach aches and all of the stuff. But at the end of the day, we get to bring joy to people's lives, and that's different from being a musician. Like there's a certain feeling that I get from being on stage when I'm playing that's totally different than what I get of sort of like giving that opportunity to an artist to present their work on stage, and like what that sort of transaction that you get to allow artists to meet their fans. That's a unique feeling compared to like being on stage. But yeah, I mean, I think that, but I still love concerts. I don't, weirdly enough, don't get it out to enough of them anymore. Just because we do, like at my venue, we do over 350 shows a year. So that's a lot of stuff to kind of, and thankfully I have an amazing staff, and I don't get out to my own club as much as I should. But it's, and I like sleep. So I'm in bed by like 9 o'clock every night. But yeah, but to your point, like, yeah, it is one of those things. It's like going around and, just getting inspiration from different places and different people and different communities. Yeah.
So let's talk about this venue. What is it called? What's the capacity? What's the struggles? What are the successes? Give us all that.
Yeah. So my venue, it's called XBK, standing for X Brooklyn. The name kind of came from that idea of when I was in Brooklyn and moving here to Iowa, and telling people I was moving to Iowa. They'd be like, "Why are you moving to Idaho? There's nothing there." And I was like, "Well, one, it's not Idaho. We're the other vegetables. We're the corn. We're not the potatoes." Um, but also like sort of, kind of highlighting that idea that I was mentioning before, that like great art and culture can be anywhere. And so sort of putting the stamp in the middle of this thing of like, you know what, I lived in Brooklyn. I'm not there anymore. Like I'm here. And this can be like the home of really great stuff. But anyway, the venue's called XBK. It's small. It's a 250 cap room here. We opened in September of 2019, as I like to say, the world's worst time to open a music venue. We were open for exactly 6 months before the pandemic hit, but was able to kind of make it through that. And it's great. I mean, I think the cool thing about having like a small independent community venue like that is like the sense of experimentation that we get to do, and the fact that we see the first line of what the next big stars are before other people get to see it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that comes through that never breaks, right? But, we get to see some of these acts that, 10 or 15 years from now are going to be playing the arenas, and that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool to be sort of at the beginning stages of that. And then also, as I said, getting to serve our community. It's very much in and of our community, and like, being able to help be one of the first stages that a local band plays on, right? Like there's lots of places where people kind of cut their teeth in the community, but like our venue is one of the first that's like their first real show, or like, when they make their first record and they put out the album and they have like their album release party, they're doing that at our venue, and that kind of stuff is like what means so much to me, is like just what we were able to give to the community. So, and I think that's the important thing too about like not just like what we're doing here at XBK in Des Moines, but I think the importance of like the independent venue ecosystem. I think I'd mentioned in part like my venue had started just before the pandemic, and I got heavily involved as one of the early folks in the National Independent Venue Association. So like worked with a close-knit group of folks to do a lot of the federal lobbying effort for the Save Our Stages campaign that was resulted in like a $16 billion grant program, the largest federal investment in the arts in American history, actually. Why they gave it to concert promoters is its own question, but we did it. And, through that got to meet tons of other venue operators from across the country that are doing exactly the same thing that we're doing here in Des Moines. And it's been so inspiring and amazing to see like these incredible humans and businesses that are bringing art and culture to their communities.
It's so funny that you bring up Niva because one of the local venues, Club XL Live in Harrisburg,
Mhm.
the GM there, Tyler, I've become good friends with him. And so they go down to the conference every year. I think it was in New Orleans last year, correct?
No, it was Milwaukee that last year, New Orleans the year before that.
Okay. And then where's this year's and when is it?
Minneapolis, and it is June. I'm going to probably get the dates wrong. I'm going to say 8th through 10th, or maybe 6th through 10. Yeah, it's like kind of the Sunday through the Wednesday, that first, sort of weekend in June.
Okay.
But it's always like it's an incredible conference, and it's so cool to see this organization that started with a handful of people just getting on the phone during the pandemic of like, what are we going to do, right? And then becoming this like behemoth of a trade association that, is having these annual conferences, and to see it go from our very first conference in Cleveland, where it was like 500 people that have gotten together, to, the anticipated attendance that we have in Minneapolis is going to be upwards of like 2,000 people, right? So it's like, it's great. It's amazing to see like the trajectory of the organization and the work that we've done as a collective.
I mean, just thank you for whatever you did. I mean, that is amazing. Like, it is one of the few success stories that came out of the pandemic. It really is. Like, that's
No, I
remarkable to say that.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
not even just, and I mean, there is the part that,
The cultural impact is just like,
yeah,
you can't put a price tag on that. Like, it's
no,
absolutely,
totally.
yeah.
Totally. And I mean, and what's really interesting is like, I've always been fortunate enough that, my venue isn't my primary source of income, right? But I had just, had put my life savings into buying this building and doing the mortgage to do all of this stuff. And, I was working for the label during the pandemic, and was basically working to keep my venue going until the grants came through. But, the other folks that were there, I mean, these are their lifelong businesses that they had built over 10 or 15 years, sometimes 20 years. And it's also interesting when you have a bunch of concert promoters who are used to just kind of moving all the time and doing stuff, and suddenly they have nothing to do. The amount of sort of collective energy, and like, it's no wonder, like, it's like we went through that process, and all of us are like, well, we can change the world. It's like, how, we've got the biggest federal investment in the arts in American history. What else can we do? Um, but I think the other part of it is having come out, like, the pandemic itself was like such a terrible, horrible thing for the world. But in terms of what it did for the independent sector, and the fact that we were, I've met people through that work that I would have maybe never known, and just the friendships and the camaraderie and the ability of the network that we've created has made the independent sector so much stronger. I mean, it is a struggle, and it's running a small venue or an independent venue is difficult, I won't lie.
Very.
But the fact that, I can call up, Dana Frank, who owns First Ave in Minneapolis, who's her venue's been around for 50 years, and, call her up and be like, hey, have you ever experienced this thing before? Do you have any advice? Or, call my friends at IMP in DC or whatever, and to be able to kind of have that network of people around me, as a new venue owner and promoter, has been amazing, amazing. And the work that the organization continues to do is astounding.
So that's a good segue. I have, because I interview a lot of bands, I interview a lot of indie bands, a lot of indie artists, a lot of unsigned musicians. One of the biggest gripes that I hear from them, and it drives me insane, and as a venue owner, I hope that you don't do this,
Uh,
but they tell me that there are venues that will charge up to 40% that will take their merchandise.
wow.
Most of it's 20 to 25%. That's kind
Yeah.
of like the industry standard. But like, can you talk about that? And like, has that been brought up at like these conferences in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of merch cuts have been, I mean, it was definitely a topic that came up probably 2 or 3 years ago. It was like, one of the key sort of issues that was coming up. And I think part of the concern is, and I'll come back to the question on merch cuts generally, but I think that part of the issue is the sustainability of the independent ecosystem altogether. And, not just from the venue perspective, but from the creator perspective too. I mean, post pandemic, our expenses as venue owners went up exponentially. Like, the amount of money that we're all paying, like, just using one metric of insurance costs, post pandemic, nearly everyone's insurance costs doubled. You look at an industry where, and you see all the trends, like, we as venue owners and promoters don't make our money off of the tickets. We make our money off of concessions, right? Of, food and beverage. And now we're in an environment where people are drinking less. I would say over since post-pandemic, drinking has gone down probably 30%, right? So you have those things where on the flip side of it, you look at the artists and, you look at, I mean, right now, gas prices, right? Like, how are people supposed to tour? You look at the expense of, renting a vehicle, whether you're renting a bus or you're renting a van or you're buying a van or something, or, for everybody, the costs of, staffing and employment, whether it's you're hiring a sound tech to go on the road with you or whether it's me hiring bartenders, like all of that stuff has gotten much more expensive.
Yeah.
And so what happens, I think, is that we're all sort of fighting for this like really small sliver of the pie, right? And, when you're looking at kind of the merch cut component, part of it is like a very practical matter. Like, I mean, my venue, most small venues don't charge merch cuts. I don't think so. I mean, I can't speak for everybody. I know that we don't. I couldn't say that, if we got a larger venue that wouldn't shift, only because the portion of, where you set up merchandise in some places, like you have to allocate space. When you're
Sure.
allocating that space, that's less places that people can be to less tickets that you can sell. That's less beer that you can sell. So it's like trying, and in the same way that if you're going into a music venue, think about it almost as like a retail store, right? It's like they don't complain that, if they sell their t-shirt online that, Amazon or whatever is going to mark it up 30%, right? So I think that there's that component of sort of the retail mechanism that, here's this venue that, everybody's trying to survive. And so everybody's trying to do this thing. And we have a retail space. And in the same way you would pay any other retailer, you would pay them a piece to sell your merchandise. And that's just kind of, how some folks look at it.
Mhm.
Um, I want to get kind of past that conversation because I think that it's like we can sit and snipe at each other all the time over like, well, you're taking this or you're taking that or you're charging this or you're charging that. That's not the problem. The problem is that there's not enough money to go around. Like, let's stop trying to like take it out of each other's pockets and figure out how to rework the economics of the business altogether. And those are the conversations that I want to have. And I think that, one of those things comes down to, you're looking at an independent sector that's competing against a monopoly. So when you're looking at these things and you're going into an independent venue, and everybody can always look at it from their own perspective, right? It's like, if you're a venue, you're looking at it from the dollars and cents that you're experiencing and,
Mhm.
have the woe is me mentality. And the same thing if you're an artist that's touring and it's like, well, nobody has it as hard as I do, from my perspective. And the thing is it's just hard all the way around. And, we're competing in an environment, at least in the venue perspective, we're competing in an environment where we don't have the same level of ability to compete and to offset the cost. So like if you have an artist that decides to go on tour at Live Nation, one, they can do sort of one-stop shopping, right? They can go to Live Nation in a day they can plan their tour.
Yep.
You're not in a position where your booking agent or you is going around to each and every venue to negotiate a deal, and that's what it is like in the independent community. So people choose the easy way, so it's like you go and you stop in there. So that means that Live Nation on some level has sort of more inventory to work with. The other part is because they're a national organization, they get to tap into sponsorship dollars that we as an independent can't. We also don't have multiple shows that we can offset expenses for, right? So like, when a show comes to my venue in Des Moines, Iowa, it may sell like gangbusters at, a venue in Minneapolis, and then they come here and our show totally bombs, right? I can't offset my losses with what my friend in Minneapolis has made, right? It's like we're sort of setting in our own environment. Whereas Live Nation, it's like, one show does well in a city, then it offsets the expense that you have the other. The other part is they participate in all parts of the value chain. They have the management companies, they own the ticketing companies, they own the venues, and they're the promoter, right? And so they get to pull money out of like all of these things. That's really hard to compete with when you're one small independent space trying to fight to get the talent to get into your venue, first of all.
With the
You know,
radius clauses and all that.
with the
You
radius
mentioned
clauses
that.
all the things, right? And that's the woe is me as a concert promoter, right? So I'm definitely coming to it from that perspective.
Yeah.
But I think that that's kind of the things that, one of the great things I think that came out of Niva is the sort of communicative nature that we have. Like, I mean, I'm wearing this T-shirt from this other company that I started called Detour with some former, or not former, but from some Niva members. We started a company. The intent of Detour was to try and work with artists to route them through independent venues. So kind of trying to create that sort of one-stop shop component to compete with the Live Nations of the world, but also allowing the venues to have their own autonomy and kind of function in their sort of own right.
Mhm.
And we ran into some, pros and cons with that and decided to start focusing more on kind of an artist development component. But I do think that, the environment for both entities is really hard. Again, I'm not going to bemoan people that are taking merch cuts. I think it's, for a venue that's a 250 cap, I think that it's wrong. Um, it's like the other part of it too is like, when you start getting up like higher and, kind of some of the artists, like a lot of times they have merchandise deals. So it's like, yeah, you're taking a merch cut, but they've already maybe gotten an advance from the merchandise companies. So it's not necessarily hurting them so much,
Right. Yeah.
Um, so I think that, again, we have to get away from, trying to figure out like, this is my dollar and this is your dollar. Let's like sit down and have real conversations about retooling the economics so it can be a functional, independent sector for everybody.
I mean, I guess how would you answer to because I have some friends that have no idea about the music business, but they'll hear that we're giving or that we've spent $25 billion in the Iran war so far,
Mhm.
and they'll be like, well, why don't they just give $1 billion of that to the music industry and that would take care of all the problems? Like, is it that simple, or like, is it really just a money issue for a lot of these venues, or like if there was some sort of government like slush fund that instead of spending all this money on defense, that we had for the arts, would like that feasibly work?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, again, like I'll say that the government subsidies that we got through the pandemic from being shut down saved a ton of businesses. And coming out of that, I think one of the positive things that a lot of different communities are working on are like venue funds or creating grant program. Like there's some great things that are happening in Cleveland. Some stuff that, unfortunately, like some of the stuff, I don't know if you've been following what's been happening in Nashville. My friend Chris Cobb, who's the head of MVAN, which is sort of the Music Venue Alliance of Nashville. So it's like all the independent venues there. They worked really hard to get legislation to create a fund for independent venues and creators that are there. They don't have the funding mechanism to like how to figure out how to do it, but the legislator sort of created this, or the legislature created this vehicle to do that. And then in the most recent session, got overridden, so they ended up not funding the vehicle that was there. Some great stuff has happened in Texas, like in Austin. They've created the ability to take a liquor tax. So part of the tax from the sale of alcohol goes to this fund to help support independent venues and kind of keep those things going. So I think there are some government mechanisms that could help. I don't want to be reliant on that. Like I think that it is important for us as, I mean, I think that the key component isn't necessarily like just let's feed a lot of money into the environment. And I'm saying this as a business owner.
Right.
As a creator, I think that's kind of separate and apart. And I think that there's value in the government making investments in the arts, like particularly when you're looking at other countries. Like I think about Canada as an example. Like, they have the sort of a national music office, if you will, that gives grants to creators to be creators. Um, I think I might be freezing. I'm not sure what's happening here. At
A
least that
little
might be
bit. That's all right. I
happening.
mean, yeah.
Um, but I think that, as a small business, I think what's important and what would actually change the business a bit is us changing the relationship that we have actually to the ticket buyer and to the consumer. again, not to go on my, bashing Live Nation and Ticketmaster, but I think that, the secondary markets and Ticketmaster have really eroded the relationship with the fan. And I think that we as a community, we as the independents need to try and find ways to rebuild that relationship. I was just looking at something on Instagram today, and there was someone, it was like a reporter from the LA Times, was like with her boss, and they were trying to buy tickets to Olivia Rodrigo or something, and it was like, they were 15,000th in the queue, and they were sitting there waiting and trying to, they're both like creating different accounts to try to get like, if it becomes like Fort Knox to buy a concert ticket, how in the world like are we going to retrain a community of people to understand that, hey, it's Friday night, I want to go to my local music venue, when they've been trained by Ticketmaster to think it's going to be,
A
like
debacle.
warfare to try
Right.
and buy a ticket, right? Or I'm going to get taken advantage of because I'm going to go try and buy a ticket. I'm going to search in my search bar, such and such artist in such and such city, and the first thing that comes up is a secondary broker site that's bilking you for twice the cost of the face value of the ticket, when there are face value tickets available on the primary market for sale at the venue, right? And I think if we can restructure that and rebuild the relationship with the fan and make ticket buying an easier experience and a fair experience, we're not going to need as much government support, right? We're not going to need that when we have the ability to get, what I like to say is butts and seats, right? And we get people now. We still have to worry, I won't say worry about, but like, yes, there's a trend in people drinking less. And those are other things like industry cycles that I think that we as an industry need to navigate and figure out. But I think, the core part of it for, the artist and for the venues is like we have to figure out how to make it easier for fans to get tickets and get to shows. And if we can do that, I think less of this conversation about subsidy is going to be needed.
Yeah, I think you're right. That will take care of a lot of the problem. But like to your point, I mean, I know people that don't watch the NFL since the whole Colin Kaepernick thing.
Yeah, yeah,
It's like, people do have these ingrained like things, and it will take a lot. And I mean, like to your point about the Olivia Rodrigo, my coworker was trying to get tickets for his girlfriend to go to the Philly show.
yeah.
And like, as soon as it went on sale, like it sold out, and he's like, my gosh, like what am I doing?
Yeah, and it's impossible. And that's some of the stuff like what Niva is working on now too. Like, we went from working on pandemic era stuff, and sort of the big sort of advocacy thing we've been working on now is the resale market. Like we're in an environment where people, you have companies that are putting up tickets for sale that they don't actually even possess. It's like we call them speculative tickets. They're fake tickets. And so it's like people are buying the opportunity to potentially get a ticket. And so we have people showing up at venues every night that are like, yeah, I, bought this ticket on, here's my ticket. And it's like, no, that's not a real ticket. And the company that you bought it from wasn't able to acquire the ticket because it was sold out. And so now you have these people that have spent money on maybe getting a hotel room, getting a babysitter, doing all of these things, and have come to this venue wanting to see their favorite artist, and they can't get in because they've been scammed by a secondary broker. Like it's crazy. It's crazy that, I mean, we have to fix that system or else it's going to ruin the entire business.
Yeah. Yeah, and for something that is like an art form that is so supposed to be pure and just like, a form of communication, that
Right.
it's just this, it's just distorted and just ugly and just,
It's
yeah.
so frustrating. And it is like, it is heartbreaking. I'm telling you, it's heartbreaking to see people. Like, there was someone, even, I mean, just as an example, at my small 250 cap room in Des Moines, Iowa, my wife is on the side, she's a comedian. And so she was doing a show at the venue and it sold out. And there was a woman who works in her office who is, an executive assistant. And she went and thought that she was buying tickets from our venue, ended up buying 4 tickets to my wife's comedy show for $200. We're selling them for $10 a pop. She paid $200 on the secondary site when she showed up. And because the show was sold out, we didn't even have her on the manifest, And I was like, oh, like we figured out a way to get her in because we're in a different sort of situation. But like, I mean, the fact that like she threw away $200, and if it had not been that I knew her, if it would have been any other venue or maybe a larger venue, she would have lost that money, would not have been able to get in to see the show. And, again, I don't mean to know what her, economic situation is, but, you're talking about someone who's an executive assistant. It's not like she has $200 to just throw away in this economy, and that's happening to people day in and day out. And it has to stop. It has to stop.
Well, I mean, obviously they tried, the
Yeah.
Department of Justice did this whole, class action lawsuit and, from a lawyer perspective and from
Yeah.
you knowing this industry, do you think that's going to make a dent in anything that they do?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, we don't really know exactly what the outcome is going to be of the DOJ case. I mean, I think it's, we're going to be probably in appeals for a very long time, and, before we really understand what the remedies are actually going to be. I think anything at this point is kind of speculation. I mean, our hope is that, they get broken up. I mean, I think that's important. Like you can't have an entity like we as independents cannot compete in an environment where you're competing against a company that owns all parts of the value chain. I mean, even in venues here in Des Moines, not mine, but there's a local independent venue that because there wasn't a Live Nation entity in our market for a very long time, when these artists would come through and they wanted to play the market, they'd play this independent venue. Well, now that there's a Live Nation room in the market, they're pulling it out of that venue. So this venue has lost probably 10 to 12 shows that they would typically get because that's a Live Nation band. And so they have to play the Live Nation venue. No matter what that venue decides to offer that artist, no matter what, like there's nothing that they can do to get that back. And you're going to kill so many independent venues. So I think that the important thing is break them up. It's like they can't have the ticketing, they can't own the management companies. Someone was just saying, I was on a text thread earlier today with some Niva members, and Dan Auerbach from the Black Keys just made a statement. It was like this interview where he was saying, we're talking about like the slogan of, tell us you're a monopoly without saying you're a monopoly. He's like, we're managed by Live Nation, trying to negotiate with Live Nation on our tour when they're the ones that are selling our tickets and, doing all these things. Like, it's insane. It's insane. Like, even for the artist, it's insane. So
And I'm
hopefully,
sure, yeah, and I'm sure too, like to your point, like merchandise, like I'm sure that Live Nation either owns a clothing company that is producing all of these concert t-shirts. So the bands are getting a cut, of course, they're not spending as much. Like,
oh yeah,
yeah,
they own Liquid Death. They own the water that you're drinking at the venue, Like, I mean, it's they own a part. And then by comparison, as independent operators, we have to work with third-party ticketing companies. So, we have to pay for that service. We are working, independently with the different agents. So, we have to like go in and we don't have the ability to like offer more. Like, we can't tap into say national, as I was saying, national sponsorship dollars to help supplement what we're paying an artist. What we're able to pay them is legit like what they can sell. Like at this point, in a lot of instances, something like 90% of the ticket revenue that's earned from the tickets are going to the artists, and then it's like there's the other part of like, okay, well, then there's like all the fees that are kind of added on top of that. Part of those fees, like in the independent sector, are not because we necessarily want them to be there. It's because we have a third party ticketing company that has a service that they have to do, right? And
we got to pass that on to you.
right, right. There's other things. There's credit card processing fees. There's like all of these, there's, all of the stuff. Like, or you look at, again, I was just talking with someone who was in a different market than mine, and, she's talking about sort of the taxes that are like added on top, and it's like, and this gets into whole, government stuff, but, thinking about, in her city, there's an 18% or 17% like liquor tax. So, on top of that, it's like, there's an entertainment tax, there's a downtown city tax that's added onto it. So it's like by the time, the artist would have set the cost of a ticket at $20, but by the time you pay all of the taxes and all of the fees and everything, you're looking at a $35,
Me too.
$40 ticket,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess what for people that aren't familiar with the industry, like if you are a an owner of the venue and also the promoter,
Mhm.
is there more advantage to doing that than to having a separate promoter for your venue?
Um, I mean, I think that it's an allocation of risk in some ways. So we co-promote with another promoter here in Des Moines, who actually happens to be partially owned by Live Nation. We do probably 4 shows a month with them. And it's just an allocation of risk. So it's like, we have them come in and we're both putting money up to make the show happen versus a scenario where I'm taking all the risk. So it can be it's higher risk, but probably higher reward, versus a scenario where like maybe you're co-promoting with an outside promoter where you're allocating the risk and you're splitting it
Okay.
in whatever way, but you're also splitting the benefit. And then the other instances where like a promoter would come in and they would just rent the room, so they come in and they just pay us a fee to have the room and then they do the other parts of it, and we don't do so much of the room rental stuff. Occasionally we do. Most of the time we try to participate in, because it's like, to me, I think it's important for everybody involved in the scenario to have a little skin in the game. And so I think that there's that. I mean, I think that the other part in terms of like the independent sector, what's even more of a factor of not necessarily like having an outside promoter come in or self-promoting shows, but I think the other part that is missing is the ownership component. Like, I'm very lucky that I own my building, whereas a lot of independent venues don't. And so you see it a lot in Austin, you're seeing it in Nashville, where you have a lot of, you have these independent promoters who are coming in, or, independent venues that are starting spaces. And, Nowheresville in a city or a town, you have the venue and then suddenly you have the coffee shop that pops up, and you have, all of these other things that kind of pop up. And then you have developers who own these buildings who suddenly, this venue is what kind of created the economic impact for this community. The venue no longer owns, no, their lease runs out and then they can't afford to renew the lease. And then suddenly they're out of a business and they've kind of built this community around them, and those are the kinds of things that, there's, again, not to make another sort of connection with Niva, but, Niva, there's a sister organization, the National Independent Venue Foundation,
Yep.
that I'm the vice president of, and it's the charitable component to, so, Niva, the trade association, handles like a lot of the advocacy kind of stuff and handles the conferences. The foundation, we do a lot of work in sort of workforce development, doing things like pathways to diverse ownership. We have an emergency relief fund and some of those things. And that's some of the work that I want to do as part of the foundation, is trying to help build more sustainable paths for those folks that are looking to get into the business, maybe looking, helping them find ways for, I mean, we don't have this yet, but helping them find ways for financing, hopefully to like be able to, purchase their own properties and to do those things so they can actually, be in the communities and control their own destiny.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about why we are here.
Yeah, yeah, I
It's
know we're
tour
like
tech.
40 minutes in or something.
I'll
Yeah.
tell you. Yeah. So it is fascinating to me. So give everybody kind of a taste of what it is, why you did it, kind of, break it all down
Yeah.
for us.
So Tour Tech is a company that we started basically, again, thinking about sort of pulling back and looking at kind of the Live Nation of it all. You know, a lot of these big corporate entities have a lot of tools in their toolbox to help the sector that they support. So, it's like Live Nation, they have centralized databases and systems and marketing platforms and kind of all of these things. And the independent sector doesn't necessarily have something like that. And so we started to basically create digital tools or other supports for, what initially was the independent sector. And our first tool is a platform called Sarah, the set list aggregator royalty application. This kind of comes out of both my nerdy side of being a copyright IP attorney, and then also understanding the live music ecosystem. So part of this story, it started probably about 5 years ago, as Niva was coming out of the pandemic, and we had succeeded in our lobbying efforts, and we were looking at some of the next big issues that we wanted to take on. And one of the things that kept emerging within the Niva membership was public performance licensing. And for a number of different reasons, it really sort of, whether it be their concerns about the number of PROs that are coming into the marketplace or what the fees are, or some of these things that, licensees generally have some concerns about,
Mhm.
sort of emanated from that. And me having spent most of my career working at a major label doing copyright and licensing, really fully understanding part of it is like, a lot of folks didn't really fully understand what they were paying for, right? It's like, you're paying these licenses and, people get into opening small venues because they love their communities and they want to put on concerts, not because they want to become experts in copyright law in the United States, right? And so, the first step was kind of explaining what they're paying for and why. And then, I started to take a deep dive and looking at it from both perspectives, both the perspective from what the experience was from the licensee component, but then also how the process worked for the creators that the PROs serve, right? And sort of how the process works is, basically dependent on the size of the venue. Venues and promoters pay anywhere between 1% and 2% of their ticket revenue into the PRO system.
Okay.
And basically, the PROs, unlike other types of distributions, when you're looking at, say, radio or you're looking at, streaming services or whatever, where there's usage data,
Mhm.
there's not reliable usage data in the concert environment. So basically, what the PROs have to do is use proxies to do those distributions. And so what happens is that they do all of these collections across the ecosystem, but they don't have data, reliable data to be able to do the distribution. So they use proxy information or survey data to make those distributions. And that typically comes from what is like the top tours, like the top two or 300 tours, or radio airplay to do those distributions. So what happens is like you have creators that are playing in venues like mine that, we're paying all four major PROs for every performance. And then the PROs are collecting that money, but instead of the creators that, by and large, folks that are playing in my venue write their own music, instead of those creators getting the money because of this proxy system, it ends up going to, for lack of a better term, Taylor Swift, right? And so what our company has come in to do is sort of twofold. One is to try and find a way to actually document what works are being performed. And so, make it easier for artists to basically report set lists. And so we can give that real live usage data to the PROs so they can use that in their distribution practice. So they don't always have to use the proxies. They can actually use what's being performed in venues and, and what artists are performing. Now, all artists right now, like you can go to your, if you're with ASCAP or you're with BMI, each of them in CSAC and GMR as well, Global Music Rights, they all have their own mechanism, individual mechanism for doing set list reporting, right? You can go to, BMI Live or you can go to ASCAP on stage and an artist, if you're on tour, you can go to that platform and you could submit the set list. But it's not very easy. Like you have to manually go in, enter what the show was that you performed, manually go in and select the songs from your catalog and those things. And then it gets into a situation. So, say, Dogg, you and I are both in a band and we're touring and we write our own music and I'm BMI and you're ASCAP. We both individually, separately have to report to our PROs for both of us to participate in the royalty pool. If I submit the set list and you don't, I get paid and you don't, right? And so what we want to do is aggregate all of that data, have one centralized place for artists to submit their set lists, and then we take that data and we disseminate it to all the PROs. So everybody who's participated in that concert, whether they're the person who's on stage or maybe they're a co-writer who's not necessarily touring, can participate in that royalty pool. And that's it. That's basically what we're trying to do. On the flip side of it, from the licensee standpoint, where this becomes important is there is, over the course of time, been more PROs that have come into the market. So, it initially started with, ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, and then in 2014, Global Music Rights came along. So that's, fourth PRO, and then in 2019, there's a new PRO called All Track that came, and there's another one's called Pro Music Rights. So we went from an environment where you had sort of three PROs to now an environment where you have six PROs. And then unlike other territories, it's not like the United States or even other licensing regimes in the United States. It's not like a mechanical license, for instance, where the government has set a statutory rate and that rate is, prorated across the rights holders. In the public performance space, it's actually additive, right? So it's, when it was ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, it was, say 1.1%, and then GMR comes in and now it's like 1.45% or something, and then you're kind of going up and up. And so with each new PRO that comes into the market,
Yeah.
the expense gets more. And because there's no data, we're basically continuing to pay all these new PROs as an insurance policy, right? But it's not like there's any more music that's necessarily being used. And the creators that should be benefiting from this, when All Track comes in and they're asking for a license and a venue is paying that license, it's not like any more of that money is necessarily going to the creator that's on the stage. It's just that All Track is getting a chunk of money that they shouldn't because their artists weren't on the stage, right? And so it's kind of extracting value out of the ecosystem. So the other part of this tracking mechanism is if new entrants come into the market, you can actually determine who you need a license from, right? And so that was one of the concerns from venues was like, we're already paying ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC. And so, now there's this GMR that's coming and seeking a license. Who are they and why? Like, why am I paying all of these people? And it's like, well, because one songwriter can only affiliate with one PRO. And if they happen to be affiliated with GMR, you have to have a license or else you're infringing. And if you don't, and so like trying to figure out to give licensees a little bit more understanding because the other part of it, as if you look at sort of other parts of the business, there's so much private equity that's getting into copyright acquisitions. It's only a matter of time, I think, before we have more PROs coming in the United States. And we're one of the only territories in the world that have a licensing regime like this. Everywhere else, it's sort of one entity, it's like in the UK, it's PRS, and, they set a tariff, licensees pay that tariff to PRS, and PRS pays everybody. Okay. Here in the United States, it's like, we work in a free market, so any PRO can pop up. You and I can start a PRO and we can go to licensees and say, like, listen, if you're playing live music, you have to pay us because we're songwriters and we have our own PRO and you might just happen to play one of our songs. Now whether it's disingenuous for us to do that or not is another question. Right. But theoretically, that's kind of how it works. And so, what we want to do, one, is to help licensees really understand who the rights holders are and have some sort of track of what's being performed in their room, while at the same time allowing artists and creators to tap into the royalty pool that they should already be tapping into, but it's not sort of the easiest process to do.
So my last question for you, because I think you're going to have a real nice take on this. AI and music. Like,
Yeah.
what should we be afraid of? What should we be concerned about? And is there anything that, like, right now, like, is this just inevitable? Is that kind of like our mindset?
I mean, I think the important part and what I see, going back to like the start of our conversation about like, sort of the dawning of the digital era. And I think that the technology developed faster than what the industry could iterate to be able to necessarily navigate the licensing regimes that needed to be built to make that happen. I think in terms of AI, I think that the industry is attacking it earlier and starting to build mechanisms to try and navigate it to make sure that rights holders who are sort of in this world and where, AI, in terms of what's being trained and all of those things to make sure that the right people are getting compensated or at least licensed in the appropriate ways. I do think that it's inevitable. I think that, I I'm still actually even in my own self trying to reconcile some of these things because as a person that in who is constantly curious and likes creativity, the idea of what AI could potentially do to expand creative things, and I'm not necessarily talking about like let's train on the catalog of Prince and create a new Prince track. Like that's one thing.
Right.
But the idea of what AI can do to create new sounds, right? Like, you think about trying to put a sound in your synthesizer, like some of these like unique sort of things that aren't as much um, taking on the IP of other artists, but like sort of, what it can do from a creative mechanism, I think could be really cool. I think that there's ways, in the same way, you look at it like sampling, right? It's like when sampling first came along, it became an art form and really developed an entire genre of music,
Sure.
but the industry didn't know how to handle it, and I think that we're we're trying to figure it out. I think that, to me, what's important is if, and, I come first and foremost as being an artist advocate and being an advocate for creators because, we have to build, and this is kind of getting away from the AI conversation, but we have to build an environment where a creator can say, I want to be an artist as my plan A, you know, and never have to rely on that plan B. And the only way that we can do that is to build an industry and build models where creators can be compensated, and tap into the different revenues that are out there. And I think that there are companies and the ways that they're trying to license catalogs for training, whether, however that may be, to make sure that you can identify what works are being trained and try and figure out what works are incorporated in this new AI thing. And maybe there's a piece that goes back to the creator and there's some kind of something that's there. I think all of that is incredibly important. Um, I also, I do think on some level it's inevitable. We're not going to be able to stop it. So I think the best thing that we can do is figure out how we can do it ethically, how we can do it in an environment that also preserves human creativity. Because, I mean, as a copyright attorney, like the entire principle of copyright was created to protect individuals and human creativity and to like help try and like spur human creativity, so like from a person who values copyright and who values what the purpose of the entire field that my career has been in, trying to find ways to do it ethically, I think is the important part. But I think that there are some really incredibly smart people that are working on it, and again working on it from the perspective of, and this goes back to like also the major label conversations. Like, I think that there are people who say like, well, labels are just trying to figure out how to do it so they can make more money and they can rip off the artists and do whatever. And it's having been inside the machine, it's not that. It's like they really are working to try and protect the creators that they represent and to make sure that human creativity is still at the core and at the center of all of this and that it still holds value. And I think if we can figure out how to develop technologies and have AI that still holds human creativity as its center, I think that that's what we have to do. There's is on this panel recently at Polestar, and someone was on who was the moderator of the panel. He made this statement, which I thought was so compelling. He was like, AI is kind of the floor, right? And the human is the ceiling, right? And so I think it's if we continue to look at it as a tool for human creativity, I think that's the best sort of approach to go about it.
It is a little concerning though to me that you're already seeing though like that country AI artist, right? That
Yeah.
had a number one hit or whatever. Like,
Hmm.
like for me, like as a human, like when you still have plenty of options for human generated like singing, that you would gravitate toward that and that would already become a number one hit. Like, do you have an explanation for that?
I mean, I think that, people like pleasure, right? So it's like if you hear something regardless of whether it's human generated or not, and you enjoy it, it's going to be a thing. I think that that's where, again, going back to preserving the live music economy, I think that's where it's really important because the difference between hearing AI slop and hearing a real artist is seeing it performed on stage.
Yep.
And I think that that is where I think we are going to move into, and I'm already kind of seeing it a little bit and having conversations. You're kind of hearing it percolate a little bit that there's a little bit of a technology backlash,
Yeah.
um, and where people want to get back to actual connection. Young kids are putting their phones away.
Yep.
Like I was actually just having a conversation with my marketing team not that long ago for my venue, and one of the Gen Xers who's on the team was like, I'm not even trying to find out about shows online anymore. Like, let's go out and like fly your cars. And, thinking about this as being like a new revolutionary concept that you go around and you have a flyer on your car or like you're standing outside with handbills. I think that people are really starved for real connection and having that real sense. And so I think that the unfortunate part of the AI component is that it is going to continue to potentially erode um, how human creators can generate revenue from online, from streaming and other kinds of, sort of not tangible
Mhm.
um, distributions. And so I think it's going to make live music even a much more, it's already become probably the largest, I won't say the largest revenue driver for an artist, but when you look at dollar for dollar,
Yep.
what they spend and what they get coming back,
Mhm.
live music is, the largest part of, capacity for them to make money.
Mhm.
And so I think that's probably going to be even more so. But it's also interesting. It was just, just being at Polestar and seeing Kiss talk about how they're doing, like these new sort of, their hologram whatever
Mhm.
thing, and it's like, and they're going to do that maybe at the Sphere, I think, or, so it's like, who knows? Who knows?
Yeah.
So you're going to have like these immersive experiences that may not be real, but I think we as humans like we thrive on connection, like that's part of human nature, and so I think that that's what's gonna, you know there can be all kinds of stuff that we can listen to that AI does, but I think at the end of the day people want to connect with one another, and you're going to do that in live, and so I think that live has a very strong future if we can figure out the economics.
Yeah, I think too, like almost like, where bars and taverns after Prohibition
Yeah,
became like gathering places for towns. Like live music venues could totally be that. Like that totally could be like, especially as you said, like with AI and with smartphones, it seems like we continue to be more like isolated,
right.
that is a
No,
great opportunity for, for that.
no, I agree. And I think that there's more like, again, and it's so interesting because everything's a little bit cyclical. And I was on, speaking of digital stuff, I was on Instagram recently and saw this kid from Brooklyn who was like sort of doing this whole Instagram thing on, these new like DIY shows that are happening at warehouses around Brooklyn and what it's like this, it's just been going on for decades. But it's like that kids are like tapping into it now and they're feeling like this environment of like, oh, I mean, the other part of it is again, like going back to that reconnection of like trying to get people to understand of thinking about going to see live music on a Friday night, but this unique experience that Gen Z is starting to have around, oh, like there are such things as house shows. There are basement shows. They are, and I think that it is like my son, my older son is 19, and so he was like that, he was one of the pandemic era kids, and you have this whole generation of kids that came out of the pandemic who in, when I was becoming a freshman in high school, that's when I started hanging out with my friends and going to basement shows and doing all of this stuff that teenagers do. Well, that generation of teenager didn't have that experience. And so I think they're just now starting to discover this stuff. And I think hopefully that will kind of change the trajectory a little bit too, and you get kids that are, excited about going to DIY shows or excited about going to their friend's house and someone playing guitar in the corner and everybody circling around singing along or whatever it may be. But I think that that real human connection is something that's going to be key.
Well, speaking of human connection, it would be great to meet you in person
Yeah,
someday.
no, absolutely.
But this is a great conversation. Thank you so, so much for doing this. I know it went a little bit past what we wanted to do, but this is great. So,
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. And again, I have a tendency to just kind of go off and monologue, so I hope you can kind of cut this together with something interesting. So.
no, it was great. It was absolutely great. So, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. So, Tour Tech, tell everybody else how anything else that we've got going on. The venue again. Let everybody know what you got going on under your hats.
Yeah, no. The main thing is, we're doing it at the venue. So if you're anywhere in the Midwest or in Des Moines, come through XPK, say hi. I know that you work with a lot of indie touring bands, so please reach out. Reach out. We wanna do what we can to help. If you are interested in just, being a promoter, learning more about this, or even being an artist or agent that's interested in this space, come to the Niva convention in Minneapolis in June. Nivaassociates.org. You can find out all information there. If you're interested in workforce development and getting involved in this space, you can go to the National Independent Venue Foundation, NIVF.org. We have a whole online training area, an online training hub that talks from everything from, how to settle shows all the way to marketing to sexual harassment trainings that you can get there. And we have like really great programs in terms of workforce development. And then in terms of tour tech and the Sarah application, right now we're in an invitation only period while we continue to work on those digital connections with the PROs. But if you have any questions regarding public performance rights, whether it be in the live music space or otherwise, I'm happy to help walk folks through it, whether you're a venue owner and promoter and trying to understand the licensing landscape, or whether you're an artist and just trying to figure out what the statement means or what you need to do to collect that money. We're here as a resource. So you can go to tourtech.live. There's a web form, just fill it out, and we'll set up some calls and yeah, and go out and have an easy time going to buy a ticket from a local music venue, go see live music, go buy merchandise from the bands that are performing there. Buy a beer if you drink. If you don't, get an NA beer or a soda or something. Put something in your face. That's how the venues make money. And just enjoy each other, and just go see a live show, man. There's nothing like it. Nothing like it.
Well, words to live by. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Tobi Parks, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, our social media pages. That helps us and the bands and artists and music professionals. Also, check out our sponsor, RAR Outfitters. That's RAWR, outfitters.com. Don't just wear, RAR. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I've been Dog. You've been great. This is the Music Lab Podcast.